Protect yourself at all times. Follow my instructions. You're gonna have a clean fight. Touch it up, make it official.
What is it about a super fight that gets fans so intrigued?
He knows the answer. Fuck you.
But this isn't just limited to fighters in two different weight classes. It's those fantasy matchups we've always wanted to see, but for one reason or another never got to. This also includes hypothetical bouts that would have been impossible to see due to a fighter being from an earlier era and on his way out the door from combat sports. And of course, this leaves fans to speculate who would have won between two fighters in two completely different eras if they were to face each other while in their prime. And we're going to try to answer these questions. It's time for a super fight. Mirko Cro Cop, the K1 kickboxing Croatian, versus Andrei Arlovski, the bearded badass from Belarus. Now, I'm not going to lie. When I first got into the UFC, Andrei Arlovski was and still is one of my favorite fighters of all time. But we're going to do our best to take an objective approach and see really who would have the edge if both these fighters fought in their physical peaks. While most people hear the name Cro Cop and think of his devastating head kick knockouts, in addition to being a black belt in Taekwondo, he also held a professional boxing record of 48 wins and 8 losses, 31 of those coming by knockout. He's one of 2 fighters to ever hold titles in both kickboxing and MMA, the other being Alistair Overeem. And he's the only fighter to win 3 World Grand Prix championships, those being in K1, Pride, and Rizin. And while Cro Cop has suffered some losses to some of the greatest kickboxers of all time, his wins have all come by way of knockout or TKO. Okay, I'm getting a little bit carried away with the hyperbole, but statistically, he did finish half. And a small correction from earlier, I mentioned professional boxing record. I should have stated amateur. I know if I don't make that distinction, the internet is going to roast me alive. Wrestlers couldn't intimidate the striker as he had excellent takedown defense. While even well past his prime towards the end of his UFC career, he clocked in a 78% takedown defense success rate, which at the time was 4th in the UFC heavyweight division for active fighters. This expert kickboxer still had half a dozen submission victories to his name, submitting the likes of Pat Barry and Kevin Randleman. In fact, it wasn't until 2011 that Cro Cop lost to anybody who wasn't a champion or title challenger under the Zuffa or Bellator banner. Yet, all the way up until his retirement, that still only accounts for 3 of his losses. As if this guy's legacy wasn't impressive enough, he holds the record for the most finishes under the Zuffa banner. But in the other corner, we have quite the formidable foe. Former UFC heavyweight champion Andrei Arlovski still to this day holds the record for the most wins in the UFC heavyweight division. And that record was pretty close to being extended considering he lost 2 split decisions and a unanimous decision loss that was controversial against Tai Tuivasa. In fact, it wasn't until 2017 that Arlovski lost to any fighter that wasn't a champion or title challenger under the Zuffa or Bellator banner. Okay, yes, Sergey Kharitonov technically made it to the Strikeforce semifinals before being eliminated and not the finals, but we're going to let this one slide. And you most likely remember that Arlovski won his UFC heavyweight belt by tapping Tim Sylvia with an ankle lock. But despite his ground skills, Arlovski prefers to keep the fight standing, and it's a lot easier to do so considering he holds the record for the UFC heavyweight division in the highest takedown defense at just over 88%. So how do these fighters stack up against one another? Well, Arlovski clearly has the ground advantage, but I'm skeptical that this will play a role in the fight. Anytime Arlovski has been willing to engage on the ground, it's usually because he's either knocked down his opponent, or his opponent is actually the one trying to take Arlovski down. And even if he does try to take Cro Cop down, I'm skeptical that he'll even be able to. Do you remember Cro Cop in his prime and that legendary sprawl? Heath Herring knows all too much about that. Even when facing very talented strikers and holding a massive advantage on the ground, Arlovski has always been more than willing to keep the fight standing and duke it out with his opponent. I think it's safe to say that the winner of this fight is going to come down to the striking skills. And of course there have been concerns with Arlovski's chin over the years, however, I think this is blown a little bit out of proportion. While there are several TKO losses on Arlovski's record, I wouldn't attribute this necessarily to a poor chin. There were several times he was clearly conscious and doing the best he could to defend himself, but ultimately poor positioning allowed the ref to step in. In fact, Arlovski has just as many KO or TKO losses as Frank Mir, who doesn't get the same criticism for having a poor chin. But the fact is he has been stopped by a number of talented strikers, such as Pedro Hizzo, Alistair Overeem, Stipe Miocic, Sergey Kharitonov. And with the possible exception of Alistair Overeem, a prime Cro Cop is a much more dangerous striker. The Cro Cop that fought Vanderlei Silva, Mark Hunt, Heath Herring, Alexander Emelianenko, and Nogueira, I think that Cro Cop takes the victory in a prime versus prime super fight.